Chapter 1. The Mauled Cart. Rain had passed in the night, but the forest still sweated with it. Water clung in beads to every needle of pine and every black twig in the undergrowth. The road, if the rutted ribbon of mud and roots deserved the name, cut a brown scar through the trees, glistening under a sky the color of old pewter. Wheels sank axle deep where the ground softened. Harness creaked. Horses snorted steam into the chill. Somewhere high above, unseen crows traded ugly cries from branch to branch like gossips in morning black. The logging crew moved through it with the stubborn misery of men too poor to turn back. There were 12 of them in all, with 2 wagons loaded with tools, chain, wedges, saws, barrels of pitch, sacks of oats, iron nails, and casks of thin ale, already watered once by a dishonest steward farther south. They were broad-shouldered, scarred men in patched wool and leather jerkins darkened by rain and old sweat, with ropey forearms and knuckles split from hard work or harder company. Their beards were rough, their tempers short, their boots caked in enough mud to bury a calf. Most smelled of wet dog, pine sap, stale drink, and men who had slept too long under wagons. At their head rode Hal Voss on a squat, bad-tempered, gelding the color of ashes. Voss had the flattened nose and broken ears of a man who had done soldiering before he'd done lumber. One side of his jaw was ridged, where a blade had opened it years ago. He wore no uniform now, only a heavy cloak with the fur gone thin at the collar, and a sword whose pommel had been wrapped in cord to keep his grip in the wet. He was not the sort of man who filled silence with talk. That alone made the others wary of him. Behind him trudged Sen, the oldest of the sawyers, with a back bent sideways by long labor and one pale eye half-filmed with cataract. He wore a little lead hammer of Sigma tied at his throat with greasy string, and touched it every time the road bent deeper into the trees. Beside him stomped Brood Capel, broad as an ox and twice as stupid by common account, carrying his axe over one shoulder as if he expected the forest itself to take offense and come at him. Jurgen, youngest of the crew and eager to prove himself harder than fear, laughed at anything that felt too close to dread. He was laughing that morning too, though too loudly and too often, like a man feeding noise into the dark to keep the dark from answering. The hired guards walked near the rear wagon. There were 3 of them, Rauk, with the notched spear and a drooping mustache yellowed by tobacco, old Hessel with a rust-flecked mail shirt and one finger missing from his left hand, and Clem, thin as a rail and forever spitting, who carried a crossbow wrapped in oiled cloth under his cloak. They had been taken on in Delbers because timber was dear, roads were bad, and anything left unwatched in the northern reaches of the Empire had a habit of growing legs or fangs. Roads cursed, muttered Sen, glancing up at the trees. Too quiet. It's a road, Brood said. Roads don't get cursed. Shows what you know. Plenty. Nothing worth having. That might have gone on a while, but a horse in the lead wagon gave a sharp, uneasy whicker and rolled its eyes white. The other answered. Leather straps twitched, ears pinned back. Even Voss's gelding tossed its head and stamped. Nobody laughed then. The forest had gone still in a way that made men notice themselves breathing. No bird called, no squirrel chittered, no wind moved in the pines. The only sound was the soft, wet suck of wheels dragging through mud and the slow clink of chain against timber. Voss raised a hand, and the column stopped. What is it? Asked Rauk quietly. Voss did not answer at once. He was looking ahead along the road where it dipped through a stand of fir and rose again between banks of fern and bramble. Something stood there in the grey light, half hidden by the mist steaming off the ground. A shape. A cart. Jurgen squinted. That ours? It should be, said Hessel. Supply cart from the village. Left 3 days before us. It ain't moved since, Sen said, and there was no satisfaction in being right. Voss swung down from the saddle. Axe is ready. Clem, string that bow. Rauk, with me. They went forward in a spreading line, boots sucking at the road, men unconsciously slowing as the smell found them. At first it was only a hint under wet earth and horse stink, something coppery and sweetly rotten. Then it thickened, sliding down the throat and sticking there. Blood, open, guts, the ripe meat reek of death, beginning to warm in its own juices beneath a cold sky. Brood swore and put a sleeve over his nose. The cart came fully into view. One wheel had broken and collapsed into the mud so that the whole thing leaned drunkenly to one side. The canvas cover had been ripped open in strips that flapped softly. One shaft was snapped clean through. Barrels and sacks lay spilled across the road, burst or torn but not taken. Flour had turned to paste in the rain. Dried beans were strewn in the muck. A chest of nails had overturned, their black heads glittering like beetles among the ruts. The horse lay where it had fallen in harness. Half of it was gone. Its rib cage yawned open like the peeled lid of a pot. Strings of pink-grey intestines steamed in the morning chill. One haunch had been stripped to bone, gnawed white, and scored deep. The head was still attached, lolling in the traces, one eye pecked out or eaten, the other bulging and fixed. Its tongue hung black from the mouth, flies already stitched around the wound rims despite the cold. Jurgen bent double and vomited into the ferns. Brood stood staring, lips parted. Wolves, he said, but the word sounded thin, like he didn't believe it himself. No, said Sen. The driver was 10 paces from the cart. What was left of him, anyway? He had been dragged through the mud on his back, heels furrowing twin lines behind him. His coat was torn to ribbons. The belly had been opened and emptied so thoroughly that the cavity looked scooped. One arm had been bitten off at the shoulder. The other was twisted under him with the hand clenched full of wet leaves and dirt. His face, what remained of the face, had been chewed until the beard was mostly red strings and exposed teeth. One cheek was missing entirely. The nose had gone. The throat was a ruin of ripped flesh and crushed windpipe. There was blood everywhere. On the road, on the spilled sacks, spattered up the wheel spokes in drying fans, sprayed across the cartboards in long black-brown streaks where rain had failed to wash it clean. Rauk crouched beside the corpse, expression hardening. No arrows, no cuts. Tore him to pieces. Beastmen? Clem asked. Voss stepped around the body without kneeling. Where are the tracks? That silenced them. They all looked then, down at the mud that should have told a plain enough story. A horse had thrashed. The driver had been dragged. The cart had slewed sideways. Their own boots were stamping the margins. But beyond that, nothing. No cloven spoor, no wolf paths, no boot prints save the dead man's and those of the horse. The road should have been written over with signs, and yet it looked wrong, blurred in places, as if whatever had come and gone knew how to tread where weight left little mark. Sen crossed himself in the old way, and then, remembering where he was, touched the lead hammer at his throat. Brood found his voice first. Could have come from the trees. Ground's thicker there. Then we'd see broken brush, said Hessel. Clem lifted the ripped canvas with the point of his quarrel and peered into the cot bed. His face changed. Here. Voss turned. What? The others gathered reluctantly. Inside the cart there should have been only supplies. Instead the planks were scarred. Deep gouges had been raked along the inside boards, crossing and recrossing each other in frantic lines. Splinters curled back from them. The wood around the marks was packed with dried blood, black in the grooves. One section of plank near the front had been clawed so savagely it looked furred. Jurgen wiped his mouth and stared. From inside? Nobody answered, because there was no better answer to give. Rauk said, Driver hauling some animal in a cage? No cage, said Voss. No chain, no bars. He touched one of the gouges with 2 fingers. The mark was narrow, not the wide rake of a bear, not the hooked trenching of a beastman talon. 5 lines, parallel, close, almost like a man's hand had done it if a man's nails were iron spikes. Sen saw it too. That's not right, Brood sniffed and spat. Mutants, then. Some tree-hiding corpse-eaters. That horse would have screamed long enough to raise the village, said Hessel. Maybe it did. Then where's the cartman's pistol? Where's the knife? They found the knife, still sheathed on the dead driver's belt. They found a cudgel near the wheel, slick with mud. They found the money box in its compartment under the seat, untouched. When Rauk pried it open, 3 silver shillings and a handful of coppers sat inside in their blood-specked cloth bag exactly as they had been packed. No thief had done this. No starving peasant either. Food remained in torn sacks. Salt pork still sat wrapped in waxed cloth. Even a jug of lamp oil lay unbroken in the ditch. Coin untouched. Food untouched. Bodies eaten. A coldness crept through the group that had nothing to do with weather. Jurgen swallowed. We should go back. Voss turned and looked at him. It was not an angry look. Angry would have been kinder. It was the blank look of a man weighing burden against necessity. We've 2 wagons, 12 men, enough iron to buy a farm, and forest thick on both sides, Voss said. You want to turn those wagons around on this road and crawl half a day backwards while whatever did this watches from the trees? Jurgen's face flushed, but he said nothing. Cabin, Voss went on. We make the cabin before dusk. Bar the doors. Light no more than we must. From there, we judge what comes next. Ila, Rauk nodded once. Hessel, too. Brood needed only the fact that a stronger wall existed somewhere ahead. Sen looked unhappy enough to gnaw his own tongue, but fear had a way of making orders sound wise. It should have ended there. Men should have lifted what they could and gone, but dread breeds delay. Brood poked through the wreckage with the foolish stubbornness of a man wanting ordinary explanations. He kicked aside a sack, stooped, and held up a scrap of cloth clotted dark. Look here. It was part of the driver's coat. Nothing more. Leave it! Snapped Voss. Brood dropped it. Jurgen, still pale from vomiting, moved to the side of the cart and flinched back. Something under there. Clem swung the crossbow down in one smooth motion. Rauk lowered the spear. Hessel drew his short sword with a hiss of metal. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then something wet and stringy slid from beneath the collapsed axle and plopped into the mud. It was the horse's liver, or a piece near enough to one. Flies rose in a buzzing knot. Brood cursed himself for jumping and tried to laugh, but the sound came out cracked. Still, while Clem peered beneath the cart, Voss watched the trees. The undergrowth seemed thicker than it had moments before. Branches hung low with rainwater, and old lichen, black and grey as hanging hair. Between trunks, shadows layered themselves in bars. It was the sort of forest in which a man could imagine faces without wanting to. Once, far to the left, something shifted, a trick of dripping boughs or something moving between them with too much care. "Did you see that?" Sen whispered. "No," said Voss, though he had. "Captain," I said no. They hitched fresh rope to the good wagon and dragged the wreck aside enough to clear the road. Nobody suggested burying the driver. Nobody wanted to put spade to earth with the trees so near and silent around them. They left him where he lay, one hand full of mud, staring through what remained of his face into the low branches overhead. As the crew resumed their march, the mood had changed entirely. Earlier there had been the grumbling of men at work, complaints about weather, ale, wages, wives, rheumatism, the stupidity of nobles, and the price of lamp oil. Now there was almost none. Even Brood kept his mouth shut. Tools knocked softly in wagon beds. Harness jingled. Men glanced behind, too often. Twice Clem halted to scan the trees with his bow half raised, swearing he'd heard something pacing them in the brush. Each time there was nothing to see, but once was enough for Jurgen to mutter prayers under his breath. The road climbed, dipped, and wound on beneath pines that closed tighter overhead, until what little daylight there was came down mean and grudging. Here and there old stone poked through the moss at the roadside, moss-swallowed markers whose carvings had long since worn away. Sen would not look at them. When they passed a toppled shrine half buried in roots, its saint's face weathered smooth, he turned his own face aside. By afternoon the sky lowered further. Dusk came early under the trees, thickening not as a color but as a substance, something that collected between the trunks and filled the road behind them. Their horses sweated despite the chill. Rauk's spear point trembled each time a branch brushed it. Then, just when the light had thinned to a dirty smear behind the forest, Brood hissed and pointed ahead. The cabin stood on a low rise above the road, beyond a churned yard of stumps and wood chips gone black with old rain. It was larger than a trapper's shack, smaller than a proper hall, a squat, broad timber structure with a steep roof, patched in places with tarred hide and mismatched shingles. One wall leaned a little, but the logs were thick and close-fitted. A woodshed slouched beside it. The remains of a split-rail fence circled the rise in broken ribs. Beyond the clearing, black pines pressed close as spectators. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. No lantern burned in the window. The place had the look of a mouth clenched shut. Voss stared up at it as men stared at keeps in war, measuring angles, weak points, chances. "Well," said Hessel quietly, "it's a roof." Sen shook his head. "Don't like it." "Neither do I," Voss said. That was the worst of it. A man like Voss admitting such a thing without shame made the fear in others feel suddenly lawful. The crew hauled the wagons into the yard under a sky already surrendering to night. Brood and Rauk ran for the door with axes ready while Clem covered the windows. The hinges groaned. Dust breathed out. Something scuttled in the dark inside Rat, most likely, and even that made Jurgen flinch. One by one they entered, boots thudding on old planks, shoulders hunched, eyes searching the corners. The cabin smelled of stale ash, Rot in the roof thatch, old sap, mouse droppings, and long abandonment. A fire pit crouched in the middle. Bunks lined one wall. There was a loft overhead and a trapdoor at the back leading perhaps to a root cellar or perhaps to something worse. Their lantern light threw bars of yellow across the beams and left the high corners in shadow. Solid enough against weather, perhaps. Solid enough against wolves. But as Voss turned and looked back through the open doorway, at the dark forest massing beyond the clearing, at the long wet road they had come by, and the trees watching from either side, he felt with soldier's certainty that they had not reached safety. They had only reached a place where the real fear would begin. Chapter 2. Scratching at Midnight. They barred the door before the last light had fully died. Brood and Rauk heaved the wagons closer first. Not to block the cabin completely, there was no time and too much mud for that, but to narrow the open yard and give the horses less room to spook. The animals hated the place the instant they smelled it. They rolled their eyes, teeth showing around the bit, stamping so hard the muck splashed up their own bellies. One of the draft mares tried to rear and nearly tore her harness loose. It took 3 men swearing and hauling on leather straps to settle her enough to get the traces off. Even then she trembled like a plucked string. Inside, Voss set them all to work with the clipped, joyless certainty of a man who knew fear was best handled with labor. Table against the door. Bunks under the windows. Timber braces if you can fit them. Hessel, loft, Clem. Shutters. Nobody alone. The cabin's interior had looked merely abandoned at first glance. Under lamplight, it became worse. The timbers sweated damp. Moss had found its way into the chinks between logs. Old smoke layered the ceiling black. The bunks were rough frames stuffed with moldering straw gone flat and sour. Rat droppings peppered the floorboards in the corners. A skinning hook still hung beside the hearth, crusted in something ancient and dark that no one wished to identify too closely. The place had been empty for months, perhaps years, but not long enough to forget men entirely. There were old knife scores in the table, burnt drips on the mantel, a cracked clay mug still sitting on a shelf beside 2 bent nails, and a child's wooden whistle split down the middle. The whistle disturbed Sen most of all. He stared at it a moment too long before muttering a prayer and turning away. Clem went from shutter to shutter with hammer and nails, fixing the warped boards more tightly over the windows. Where the hinges had rotted, Brood and Jurgen jammed in, wedges hacked from old cut logs, piled under the eaves. Hessel climbed to the loft, driving down spare pegs to secure the ladder and peering through the gaps in the roofline for any sign of movement outside. Rauk looped chain through the door ring and around an iron staple sunk into the wall beam, then set the heavy table on its side behind it, legs facing inward like broken spears. The cabin filled with the sounds of frantic fortification, hammer blows, grunting men dragging furniture, the bite and tear of nails being forced through old timber, boots thudding over boards. Every sound seemed too loud, too eager to advertise living flesh huddled in one place. Voss found the back trap door and tested it with his heel. It shuddered on swollen hinges. Something cold breathed up through the seams, smelling of earth, mold, and stagnant water. No cellar visible from above, only a square of blackness between the cracks. "Open it?" asked Rauk. Voss weighed the question a long moment and shook his head. No, not till morning. They laid a chest of tools across it anyway, then another on top of that, iron heads clinking inside. It was not enough to stop anything determined. It was enough to keep men from thinking too much about what lay under the floor. By the time darkness thickened beyond the shutters, the cabin had been turned into a poor man's redoubt. The hearth burned low, more embers than flame, because bright light made targets of faces and windows alike. Lanterns were hooded to slits. Tools became weapons by necessity and distribution. Every man kept something near to hand: an axe, a splitting maul, a saw, a spear, a knife. Clem sat nearest the front room, with his crossbow loaded and laid across his knees. Hessel kept his sword out, oiling the nicked edge with a scrap of cloth and lamp grease, while pretending not to listen to the woods outside. For a little while the work had kept them from panic. Once the bracing was done, and men sat with their own breathing and the hush beyond the walls, panic came creeping in to occupy the empty places. Brood broke first, as men like him often did when action ran out and thinking began. "I still say wolves." No one answered immediately. Rainwater ticked from the eaves. Somewhere in the walls, a beetle or woodworm made a small dry tapping that caused Jurgen to start and look up sharply before he realized what it was. "Big wolves," Brood went on, too loudly. "Winter-starved, bold, that's all." Sen gave a bitter little laugh from where he sat on a bunk, turning the lead hammer charm between his fingers. "Aye. Wolves what carry off silver and leave it lying. Wolves what climb into carts and claw the planks from inside. Could be beastmen. No spoor. Could have rained it out. Ah, rain don't wipe what never was." Brood glared into the hearth, as if anger at Sen could banish the memory of the cart. Then what? Nobody wanted to say it. In the Empire there were always too many things that answered a question like that. Beastmen with goat eyes and rusted cleavers, forest goblins who liked to hamstring horses, outlaws, mutants in hides, the unquiet dead. A man could get by most of his life pretending such things belonged to rumors and distant roads, but the northern forests had a way of closing that distance. Jurgen wiped damp palms on his trousers. "Village folk said there were old graves out here." "Village folk say a lot," said Clem. "They said the old road cut through a barrow field. Said one of the counts buried his kin in these woods before the line died out. Peasants piss themselves at owl calls," Brood muttered. Sen looked up sharply, his one good eye pale in the dimness. "And sometimes they piss themselves for reason. I seen a barrow opened once, south of Middenland. Men thought there'd be silver cups in it. They found bones instead. Bones that weren't content staying put." Brood snorted, but quieter this time. "Enough," Voss said. "That shut them up." He sat near the door, sharpening his sword on a whetstone with slow, even pulls. Steel hissed softly. His face gave little away, but the deliberate rhythm of the work told its own story. Men sharpened blades before battle and before slaughter. Nobody sharpened them for peace. Outside, the forest retreated from sound. At first, there had been a little of it, a branch shifting, drips in the needles, the occasional far rustle of something small in the underbrush. Then, gradually, even those thinned and vanished. It was not the natural quiet of evening. It was absence, a great listening, hollow, pressing its ear to the cabin walls. No owls, no fox bark, no wind. The horses felt it too. Through the shutter cracks came the soft, nervous stamp of hooves, from the lean-to and the wet blowing of nostrils. Then those sounds diminished as the animals settled into the terrible obedience of prey that knows something is near and hopes stillness might buy mercy. Hessel took first watch in the loft. Rauk had second. Voss said he would take no watch because he did not intend to sleep. Jürgen tried to laugh at that and failed. The hours dragged. Men nodded, jerked awake, muttered, drank sparingly from the ale cask, and wished they had not. The low hearth turned the cabin's middle into a basin of red light. Every face beyond it looked hollowed, cheekbones sharp, eyes deep as finger-pushed holes in clay. Shadows thickened in the rafters. Twice Brood was certain he saw movement up there, and raised his axe before Hessel hissed down from the loft that it was only the lamplight jumping. Sometime near midnight, when men had fallen into that brittle state between vigilance and exhaustion, the first scratching came. It was so faint at first that only Sen reacted. His head jerked toward the right wall. His grip tightened on the charm at his neck. "What?" whispered Jürgen. Sen held up one finger. There it was again. Scratch. A slow, testing drag across the outer log. Not the random scrape of branch against timber. Not the skitter of a rat. A sound with intention in it, thin and dry and patient. Like a nail being drawn along a coffin lid from the outside. Everybody in the room froze. Scratch. A little longer this time. A little lower. Clem rose to one knee, bringing up the crossbow. Hessel eased down the loft ladder soundlessly, sword in hand. Brood's lips peeled back from his teeth in something that was not bravery. "Mouse," he whispered. No one even looked at him. The scratching ceased. For a heartbeat, the cabin held only the sound of breathing too many men remembering the cart at once. Then it came from the other wall. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jürgen made a noise in his throat, almost a sob and almost a laugh, both ruined by fear. He stared toward the sound, as if sight alone might let him look through the boards. The scratching moved slowly along the logs, pausing now and then continuing with the maddening deliberation of searching fingers. "It's going around," Rauk breathed. Above them, something tapped on the roof. Not scratching. Not yet. Just a single soft knock, then another, as though something light had landed there and was balancing on the shingles. Every face lifted. The roof timbers creaked. Then the scratching began overhead too. A long, careful raking, traveling from ridge beam to eaves in a slow crawl. Something with many points of contact. Something light enough not to crash through. Clever enough not to hurry. Brood lost his nerve first. "Open the hearth up," he hissed. "More light." "No," said Voss. "We can't see." "They can. What if they're already?" Voss turned his head, and whatever Brood saw in his eyes shut him up harder than a slap would have. The scratching multiplied. One wall, then another, then the roof again. Not random. Not an animal worrying at shelter in blind hunger. This was examination, testing, mapping the shape of the cabin by touch, feeling for gaps between logs, measuring shutters, learning where the men sat by the heat of their bodies and the vibration of their breath. Jürgen had started whispering prayers, the words tumbling over each other. Some were to Sigmar, some to Ulrich. At least one was a child's bedside mutter to Shalya that he probably had not spoken since fever took his sister years ago. Terror made all gods seem near and equally deaf. "Barrow ghouls," Sen said hoarsely. "I told you. Gnaw men from old graves. Hold your tongue. snapped Rauk, though he too looked pale. The scratching stopped all at once. Silence rushed in so hard it felt like pressure. For 3 heartbeats there was nothing. Then from just beyond the shutter beside Clem came a voice. "Hello?" The word was muffled through wood, but unmistakably human. Female, perhaps, or a youth's voice. Thin, trembling. "Hello? In the cabin, please." Every man in the room jolted as though struck. Clem nearly loosed the crossbow into the shutter itself. Jurgen half rose. "By the gods." "Sit down," said Voss. "But there's someone." "Sit down." The voice came again, weeping now. "Please, please let me in. They're in the trees." Sen made a strangled sign over his chest. Brood's axe lowered a little in his hands as instinct warred with horror. Even Hessel's grim face faltered. A lost traveler, a villager, a child perhaps. The Empire's roads coughed up wretches by the dozen. Men who left the weak outside to die often found the memory clinging worse than blood. Then the voice changed, not in words, in timbre. A wetness entered it. A smile, somehow audible through timber. "Cold," it said in the same tone the dead cartman might have used asking for a blanket. "Let me in." Jurgen stared, mouth open. The thing outside the shutter laughed softly. It was almost human laughter, almost. Too breathless, too full of the throat, as if learned from hearing and repeated by a mouth shaped wrong for the work. Rauk's face drained of color. "Do not answer," a second voice called from the far side of the cabin, male this time, thick and slurred as though the speaker's jaw were broken. "Harl, Harl, Voss! Open up, you bastard! They got me." Voss did not move. Jurgen turned to him in disbelief. "How does it know you're—" The answer arrived from memory. The cart, the dead driver, the road. Men talking loud enough in the yard while unloading. Names carry in still air. Outside, the false voice rose into a desperate shriek. "Open! Open, you pig son! They're eating!" The scream cut off in a bubbling gargle that ended in chewing sounds. Something inside Jurgen broke. He lunged for the door. He did not get near it. Voss stood and caught him by the back of the neck and belt in one violent motion, hurling him sideways into the table. Jurgen struck hard enough to lose his breath. Before he could scramble up, Brood and Rauk were on him, one pinning his shoulders, the other slapping a hand over his mouth as tears and panic made him thrash like a netted fish. "Listen to me," Voss snarled down into his face, voice low and murderous. "If that door opens, we all die. You understand?" Nod. Jurgen's eyes bulged. After a moment, he nodded frantically. Voss released him and stepped back. No sooner had the struggle ended than a horse outside screamed. Not a whinny, not a panicked cry, a scream. A full-throated, tearing shriek of mortal animal terror that rose so sharply it seemed to rip the cabin air open with it. Hooves hammered the lean-to, wood cracked, harness rang. The horse screamed again and again, each cry rawer than the last, until one ended in a choking wet crunch. Then came a sound the men inside would remember to their graves, feeding, snorts and tearing, wet jerks, a hide being ripped open, the thick slap of something dragged through mud, bone crunching under powerful jaws, or many smaller ones. The lean-to banged and shuddered with impacts. A hoof kicked the wall once from outside, so hard dust puffed from the chinks between the logs. Brood turned away and retched into the ashes beside the hearth. Clem had gone white around the mouth. There were 3 horses out there. Now there's 2, Hessel muttered. No, said Sen, listening with dreadful care. There'll be none by dawn. The feeding went on for several minutes. The men could do nothing but hear it. Hear flesh part, hear an animal's ribs open, hear creatures worrying at tendons and abdominal wall like dogs with offal, except dogs did not murmur to each other in low, eager clicks while they ate. Once something laughed again, softer this time, intimate and almost affectionate. When at last the noise lessened, the cabin seemed fouled by it. The smell came next, creeping through the shutter cracks and under the door. Hot blood, horse guts, opened bowels, and that same copper-sweet rot from the cart, but fresher now, thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Jurgen curled on the floor and wept soundlessly. Some time after that, the wounded man began to come apart. His name was Mathis, a broad-chested cutter who had gashed his forearm earlier hauling one of the tool chests across the trapdoor. At the time, it had seemed nothing, just an ugly scrape from a broken iron strap or splintered nail. Hessel had wrapped it in cloth and told him to stop bleeding on the floor. Now Mathis sat hunched on a bunk by the back wall, skin gleaming with sweat despite the cold. At first he merely muttered. Then he began scratching at his bandage. Sen noticed. "Leave that be." Mathis didn't seem to hear. His eyes were fixed on the floorboards between his boots. He was breathing too fast. The tendons in his jaw stood out like cord. "What's under there?" he whispered. No one answered. Mathis leaned down, head cocked, listening. "You hear them?" Rauch glanced at Voss. "He's fevered." "You hear them," Mathis insisted louder. "Under the boards." He tore the bandage off. The wound beneath was no mere scrape now. The flesh around it had gone angry and swollen, ridged black red as spoiled meat. Thin threads of dark fluid oozed from the split skin. Whether from rust, filth, or some fouler contamination, the arm looked wrong enough to draw every eye in the room. Jurgen recoiled. "Gods!" Mathis began digging his nails into the edges of the wound, clawing at it as though something inside wanted out. He gasped with pain but did not stop. Skin peeled under his fingers. Blood ran bright over his wrist, then darker where it mingled with the seepage. When Hessel took a step toward him, Mathis jerked away and slammed back against the wall. No, don't touch me." "Sit still," Hessel said. "They're under the floor," Mathis rasped, scratching. "They know my name. There's nothing under there." "There is." He launched himself off the bunk and dropped to his knees, pressing one ear to the boards. The room held still around him, every man horrified enough to listen too. For a moment there was only silence. Then faintly, impossibly from beneath the cabin came a scrape. Mathis shrieked. He sprang up in a frenzy, overturning the bench and snatching for the nearest tool. His hand closed around a short, splitting hatchet. Before anyone could stop him, he brought it down on the floorboards. Once, twice, the third blow bit deep and stuck. Brood lunged first, catching him around the chest. Mathis twisted with startling strength, slamming the back of his head into Brood's nose with a crack that burst blood across both their faces. Brood bellowed and let go. Mathis swung the hatchet wildly. It clipped Rauch's shoulder and opened leather and flesh together in a red flap. Rauch howled, stumbled back, and would likely have been split across the temple next if Voss had not crossed the room in 2 strides and driven his fist into Mathis's mouth. Teeth flew. Mathis hit the wall, slid halfway down it, and came back up spitting blood and enamel, eyes gone almost animal with pain and fever. "Get off me!" he screamed, though no one was touching him. He charged. Voss met him chest to chest. They crashed into the table, sending a lantern skidding. Oil splashed. Hessel caught it before it spilled into the straw ticks. Matthis clawed at Voss's face with his good hand, nails raking bloody furrows across the old scar on his jaw. He tried to bite too, snapping his teeth like a dog. Voss rammed his thumb into the wounded man's eye socket. Matthis shrieked and reared back, just enough for Brood Nose pouring blood, eyes wild to swing the butt of his axe into the side of Mathis's knee. The joint exploded with a hideous popping crunch. Matthis dropped, screaming, leg bent wrong beneath him. Even then he did not stop fighting. He hacked at Brood's shins with the hatchet. Hessel stamped the wrist. Bone cracked. Fingers sprang open. The hatchet clattered away. For a few seconds the cabin became nothing but grunts, boots, and meaty impacts as they beat him down and pinned him. Matthis writhed under them, froth and blood hanging from his lips, one eye swelling shut, the other fixed not on the men restraining him but on the floorboards. "They're here," he kept saying. "They're here, they're here, they're here." Sen backed away until his spine hit the wall. "More preserve us." "Rope," said Voss, breathing hard. They bound Matthis' hand and foot with wagon line, then lashed him to the base of a bunk, where he could do no more damage. He twitched and muttered, and occasionally laughed to himself in a voice so unlike his own that even Brood would not look at him. Blood from his ruined mouth pooled on the floorboards and crept into the hatchet cuts he had made. Then, because the night had not yet done with them, something long and pale slid through a crack beside the shutter. At first, it looked like a root probing through soil. Then it curled. Clem shouted. Hessel lunged. The thing recoiled halfway, but not before every man saw it clearly in the fire glow. A hand, white as old tallow, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones, nails black and curved, fingers too long by a knuckle. Human in all the ways that mattered, inhuman in all the ways that followed. It flexed once, delicately, as though tasting the room, then vanished back into the dark. No one spoke after that. They did not need to. The cabin had been tested. The things outside were no beasts in a blind frenzy. They were deliberate, curious, hungry, and horribly close to being men. The scratching began again, slower than before, and this time when it moved along the walls, the men inside could almost imagine those pale fingers dragging lovingly over the wood, marking where the flesh waited. Chapter 3: The Hands in the Dark. The hand came back before any man had the courage to speak of it. For several stretched, miserable minutes after that white thing had slipped through the shutter crack and withdrawn, the cabin held itself in a silence so taut it seemed one more heartbeat might tear it. Matthis muttered in his bonds. The scratching moved patiently over the outer walls, roof, shutter boards, then paused, then started elsewhere. The creatures were not battering the cabin like wolves in a frenzy. They were feeling it out, learning it, finding where age, damp, and neglect had softened the wood. That was worse. Brood wiped his bloody nose on his sleeve and tried to steady his breathing. Raux sat against the wall with his shoulder cut open, one hand pressed to the wound while blood slicked between his fingers and soaked the leather beneath. Clem kept his crossbow trained at the shutter gap where the hand had appeared, though his hands shook so badly the quarrel's head wagged with every breath. Hessel stood near the hearth, sword low, listening with his mouth set in a thin, hard line. Sen had not stopped fingering his Sigmar charm since the first scratching began. His knuckles had gone pale with the pressure. Voss said nothing. He looked at the walls, not at the shutters or the door, where men expected attack, but at the seams between the old logs where black chinking had shrunk and cracked with weather, at the roof beams, at the chimney throat above the hearth where soot shifted every time something moved outside on the shingles. The scratching on the wall to his left changed. It no longer traveled. It gathered in one place. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A patient sawing of nails against timber. Then came a low, splintering creak. Clem hissed through his teeth. There, everyone turned. Between two logs beside the shutter, where damp had swollen and rotted the chinking black, a narrow, pale point pushed through into the cabin interior. Not a claw exactly, a fingertip, white and hairless, with a blackened nail as thick as a knife blade. It hooked, withdrew, then came again with more force. Bits of brittle old filler crumbled inward onto the floor. Brood took one involuntary step back. The fingertip was joined by another. Then a third. A hand was worming its way through the seam, joint by joint, impossibly narrow at first and then widening with a nauseating, insect-like persistence, as if the bones bent in ways bones were never meant to. Skin stretched over it like wet parchment. The knuckles jutted too far. The fingers were too long, each one seeming to have an extra articulation that let it curl and reach with hideous delicacy. Jürgen made a strangled sound. The hand flexed inside the cabin, blind and searching. It groped at the air, then found the inner face of the log, and pulled. The gap widened, with a wet crunch of old wood. "Hit it!" Voss barked. Brood needed no second order. He lunged in with the wood axe, both hands high on the haft, and brought it down in a savage diagonal chop. The blade bit through wrist and timber together with a hard, chopping crack. For a heartbeat the hand remained attached by ragged skin and black stringy sinew. Then Brood yanked the axe free, and the severed thing dropped onto the cabin floorboards. Black blood sprayed in a hot arc. It spattered Brood's face and shirt. It struck the wall in greasy droplets. It hit the hearthstones and hissed where it touched ember heat. The smell rolled through the room at once: rotted meat, opened grave soil, old copper, and some sweeter corruption underneath that made the stomach lurch. The hand was still moving. Its fingers clawed blindly at the planks, clicking nails on wood like beetle legs. One finger curled around itself, another spasmed. Then the whole severed thing lurched toward Brood in a twitching, mindless grasp, until Clem gave a whimper of disgust and pinned it to the floor with a crossbow bolt through the palm. It wriggled around the shaft for several seconds before finally going still. Outside the wall, something shrieked. Not an animal cry, not human either. A raw, tearing scream that rose through several pitches at once and broke into coughing snarls. More voices answered from the dark all around the cabin, thin yelps, furious chattering, a frenzy of clicking throats and wet teeth. The careful testing was over. Sen stared at the hacked-off hand nailed to the floor. "Ghouls," he whispered. "More's mercy. Ghouls. Not just ghouls," said Hessel, and his voice sounded old all of a sudden, because they all understood it now. Grave-eaters, perhaps, corpse-fed scavengers from forgotten crypts. But the pale hand had been too long, too knowing, too close to human. This was something fouler than hungry carrion beasts. Something with a memory of men still in it. something that wore humanity like stretched skin over a different hunger. The wall boomed. A heavy impact slammed the outer logs hard enough to send dust raining from the rafters. Then another. The whole cabin shuddered. "Braces!" shouted Voss. "Hold the walls!" Men surged to obey, because work was all that kept panic from taking their throats. Brood and Rauk threw their shoulders against the weakening seam as Clem and Jürgen rammed a spare plank across it and drove wedges against the opposite beam. Hessel kicked the severed hand aside and snatched up the fallen hammer. Sen dragged another tool chest against the back wall with frantic, jerking effort. Mathis had begun laughing again in the bunk lashings, blood bubbling in the gaps where teeth were missing. The next hit came from the roof. A crash overhead. Scrabbling claws. The sound of shingles tearing loose. Then the chimney erupted. Something long and pale shot down through the soot throat in a spray of black ash and half-burned cinders, hit the edge of the hearth on all fours, and came in among them, shrieking. Jürgen saw it first and froze. It had once been man-shaped. You could tell that much. A head, a chest, 2 arms, 2 legs. But starvation and some more ancient degradation had pulled it into a hideous parody of a man. Its limbs were too long, elbows and knees knotted out at wrong angles under corpse-pale skin stretched taut over cably muscle. Its belly was sunken hard against the spine. Its ribs showed like barrel hoops. The face was worst. Hairless, lipless. The mouth split wide enough to show long yellow fangs set in black gums. The nose almost gone to 2 slits. The eyes round and glossy and dead dark in the firelight. Grave filth clung in its nails and the folds of its skin. Soot and old blood striped its chest. It hit the floor running, not upright crawling, galloping on hands and feet with appalling speed. Rauk thrust his spear by instinct. The creature twisted around it like smoke. Its teeth snapped shut on the shaft and bit clean through seasoned ash wood. Then it was on him, climbing his body in a blur of pale limbs. Rauk screamed as black-nailed fingers hooked into his cheeks, and 1 foot clawed his shoulder wound open to the bone. The creature bit his throat. Not a clean bite, a tearing one. Its fangs punched into the side of his neck and ripped outward. Flesh peeled open in a wet red flap. Blood fountained across the wall, and the creature's face. It hung on while he flailed, kicking and punching, worrying the wound wider with savage little jerks of the head like a terrier shredding meat. Brood roared and swung his axe. The blade caught Rauk first, splitting collar and shoulder to the chest in a ruin of leather, bone and lung. The same stroke buried into the creature's back and hacked halfway through the ribs. Rauk and the ghoul collapsed together, one already dead, the other shrieking and trying to pull itself free while dark blood poured in oily ropes from the wound. Hessel stamped on its spine and drove his sword down through the base of the skull. The point burst out through the creature's mouth, knocking broken teeth and tongue onto the floorboards in a spray of black gore. It convulsed around the blade, fingers clawing, heels drumming, then went limp. That should have been shocking enough to numb them. Instead, it was only the beginning. The roof broke in, with a splintering crack. Rotten shingles and laths burst inward over the loft. One of the creatures came through head first in a rain of wood chips and moss, caught the beam with 1 long arm, and hung there upside down, hissing. Another pale face appeared beside the hole, grinning with bloody gums. Clem loosed his crossbow and put a quarrel through the hanging creature's shoulder. It barely seemed to notice. It let go and dropped straight into him. Both went down. Clem got one scream out, before the thing hit him face first and began chewing. Its nails punched through his cheeks to hold his skull still while it bit away his nose, upper lip, then half an eye, in 3 rapid snapping mouthfuls. Clem shrieked like a hog at slaughter, hands slapping uselessly at its shoulders. Hessel hacked at it, missed, and chopped into Clem's collarbone. That turned the scream into bubbling. Jurgen jabbed downward with a broken spear haft. The sharpened splinter drove into the creature's side. It twisted and lunged off Clem onto him instead. They struck the wall together. Jurgen was younger, stronger, and terrified enough to fight like a madman. He jammed his forearm across the creature's throat to keep those teeth off his face, while the black nails ripped open his chest and belly in parallel lines. Cloth parted, skin parted, warmth spilled down into his waistband. He howled and head-butted it hard enough to split his own brow. The creature laughed in his face, laughed, with Clem's blood dripping from its teeth. Brood buried the axe in the back of its neck. The head did not come off clean. The blade stuck halfway through vertebrae. Brood wrenched, swore, planted a boot between its shoulders, and ripped the axe free in a gout of black blood and grey, stringy matter. Jurgen kicked the convulsing corpse aside and clapped both hands to the ruin of his belly, staring at the red seeping through his fingers as if it belonged to another man. "Hold yourself in," Sen muttered wildly, shoving a rag at him. "Hold yourself in, boy. Hold yourself in." Then a shutter burst open. The wedges Clem had driven into the left window finally gave under repeated probing from outside. The boards banged inward, and 2 pale arms shot through at once, groping, clutching, tearing for anything alive within reach. Black nails raked Hessel's temple to the skull. Another hand found Brood's beard, tangled in it, and yanked his face into the sill hard enough to crack teeth. He roared and slammed the axe haft across the arms. Bones snapped like kindling. One hand released him, only to seize Sen by the throat. The old sawyer clawed at those long fingers, heels scraping the floor, face darkening as he was dragged toward the shattered opening. Through the gap behind the grasping arms came glimpses of the things outside. Pale, skullish faces pressed close together in the dark, more eyes than there should be, mouths opening and shutting with wet anticipation. Voss reached the window in 3 strides and chopped downward with his sword. He severed the hand at the wrist. Sen fell backwards, coughing and clutching his neck. The stump recoiled, pumping black blood through the window gap. Another face thrust in at once, jaws snapping. Voss drove the sword through its open mouth and out the back of its head. Something seized the blade from outside and yanked. Voss nearly lost the weapon with it. He braced both feet and tore it free, bringing with it half the creature's jaw and a spray of dark arterial filth. For a few seconds the cabin was nothing but slaughter in close quarters. No lines, no order, just men and monsters hacking, stabbing, slipping in blood and losing bits of themselves in the half-light. A ghoul came slithering through the roof hole and landed on Hessel's back. Its teeth found the side of his head and sheared the ear off in one bite. He screamed and slammed himself backward into the wall until the creature's spine crunched, then reached over his shoulder, caught it by the face, and ripped. The lower jaw came away in his hand, tongue wagging from it like a butchered eel. The thing still kept clawing until Brood stove its skull in with the pole of the axe. Another squeezed through the breached wall seam where the first hand had tested them. It came sideways, boneless as rope, forcing shoulders and ribs through a gap no grown man could have passed. Matthis, bound and raving on the bunk below, was the first thing it found. It fell on him with grateful hunger, biting through cheek and mouth while he shrieked through broken teeth. Since he was tied, he could not even curl away. The creature tore his throat out in 2 great mouthfuls and kept feeding there in a ghastly ecstasy, black gore and human blood mixing down its chest. Jurgen saw that and lost whatever reason he had left. With his guts only barely held in by both hands and a belt Sen had tightened across him, he gave a high, ragged roar and charged the feeding ghoul. He buried the splintered spear stump into its eye, then again through the side of the skull, then again and again until the point snapped off inside. Even dying, the creature seized him by the wrist and bit off 2 fingers before Voss split its neck open with the sword. Jurgen fell to his knees, whimpering, clutching the hand to his chest like a child protecting a toy. The lantern went over in the struggle. Oil spread across the boards and flamed. For 1 terrible second, fire threatened to do what the ghouls had not. Then Voss kicked the burning lantern under the corpse of the chimney creature and smothered it in gore and torn flesh. The room plunged deeper into red gloom. Brood, panting like a bull, snatched a brand from the hearth and wrapped its burning end with pitch cloth from a barrel. Hessel did the same. Torches flared up thick and smoky, painting the room in violent orange. The creatures hated flame. That was the first good thing to happen all night. The pale faces recoiled from the windows. Those still on the roof hissed and skittered back from the chimney and broken shingles. 1 ghoul in the back room was caught full in the face by Brood's torch and shrank away shrieking, skin blistering where the pitch flame touched it. Hessel drove forward and gutted it from groin to breastbone. Its insides came out black and steaming, stinking like rot and old cellars. It flopped, grasped weakly at its own spilled viscera, and died trying to pull them back in. The sudden breathing space did not feel like victory. It felt like the eye of some worse storm. Bodies and body parts littered the cabin. Rauch lay in pieces by the hearth, his throat a red cave. Clem had no face worth naming. Mattis was being eaten even in death, 1 arm stripped nearly to the elbow. 3 of the creatures lay hacked apart across the floor, their black blood making the boards shine. Smoke from the torches mixed with soot, blood stink, and open bowels until every breath tasted burned and rotten. There were only 5 men still on their feet now. Voss, Brood, Hessel, Sen, and Jurgen, though the last was half-folded over himself, grey with shock, the front of his trousers soaked red, 3 fingers gone, and his belly tied in rags. Outside, the creatures had not left. They circled, skittered, whispered, because now, with the brief lull and the torchlight pushing them back, men had enough wits to think. Sen was the one to piece it together first. He stood with 1 hand against the wall, chest heaving, soot and blood caked in the wrinkles around his eyes. "Old ruin," he said. "There was talk." Brood spat blood and a broken tooth. "Talk of what? Eh? Oh, on the road from Delbers. Carter, at the alehouse, said the cutting site was near stones in the wood, half swallowed by roots. Old place of a noble, he said, or a shrine. Steward told him to keep his mouth shut and take the coin." Hessel wiped gore from his face. "You chose a fine time to remember that. I thought it were peasant wind." Voss's jaw worked. "The cart reached it first." Sen nodded shakily. "Aye, supply cart blunders too close, maybe breaks a wheel near the ruin, maybe opens some old pit digging it free. These things come up for the horse. taste flesh, then more of them catch the scent. He looked at the dead ghoul by the hearth and swallowed. Grave feeders, nesting in old stone and barrow dirt, sleeping deep till fools with axes and wagons woke them. Not random then, Hessel said. No, the word hung in the smoke. Not random, not a passing nightmare. The men had entered a feeding ground, an old buried place the forest had hidden, out of mercy or spite, until timber contracts and road cutting pried open its skin. This cabin had not saved them. It sat in the monster's yard. The roof creaked again. Voss's head snapped up. Back room, move. There was a smaller storeroom beyond the main chamber, meant for salt, meat, and tools in better days. No windows, only one narrow door and the trapdoor corner beyond it. They had ignored it earlier because the whole cabin had seemed defensible enough. Now the main room was too broken, too open to roof and shutters. Brood and Hessel dragged the surviving tool chests. Sen hobbled after them with a torch and the ale cask for whatever use fire or drink might yet have. Voss half carried, half pushed Jürgen. The boy left a trail of dripping blood and muttered fragments of prayers to any god who listened to men with their insides coming loose. They retreated, step by step, blades out, torchlight thrust toward every opening as pale shapes tested the threshold again. One ghoul flung itself through the roof breach and landed in Rauk's remains, feeding at once without even glancing up. Another face appeared in the smashed window, lips skinned back from fangs, but shied away from the fire. The storeroom was cramped and foul with old mold, but defensible. They shoved chests, bunks, and the broken table across the doorway, wedging the barricade with axe handles and pry bars. Hessel drove nails through overlapping planks with shaking hands, while Brood braced his shoulder against the stack and grunted every time something hit the other side. Voss took the last torch and thrust it into an iron ring on the wall, filling the small room with greasy light and long dancing shadows. Then they stopped moving, because there was nowhere left to fall back to. 4 of them stood. One lay propped in the corner trying not to die. Beyond the barricaded door came the sounds of the dead, and the not yet dead being eaten. Wet chewing, bones cracking between strong teeth, the soft scrape of nails on planks as the creatures shifted and fed. Once, something dragged across the floor outside with a heavy, fleshy sound, followed by delighted chittering from several throats at once. Inside the little room, no one spoke. They listened to the ghastly feast only inches away, each man staring at the door as if he could already see the next pale hand slipping through the cracks. And beyond the chewing, faint but steady now, another sound had begun, not scratching this time, digging, from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Chapter 4. Dawn Prince. At first light, the scratching stopped, not faded, not drifted off into distance. Stopped. One moment it was there beyond the storeroom door, the dry, patient rasp of black nails on timber, the soft thud of something lean and jointed, shifting its weight just outside, the wet chewing of creatures, worrying stubbornly at the dead. The next, the whole cabin fell into a silence so sudden and complete that it seemed to strike the men inside like a blow. Voss did not trust it. He stood with his back to the stacked tool chests and shattered planks they had made into a last barricade, sword hanging low in one hand, the other braced on the wall to keep himself from swaying. He had not slept. None of them had, though Jürgen had drifted in and out of a feverish stupor in the corner, waking only to whimper and clutch at the ragged wrappings Sen had bound around his ruined belly. The torch in the iron ring had guttered low to a greasy red tongue. The storeroom stank of pitch smoke, old mold, opened bowels, sweat, fear, and the blood drying on 4 living men who no longer looked much like men at all. Brood sat on an overturned salt box, with his axe across his knees and his head drooped forward, not asleep but sagging under the weight of his own body. His beard was glued into spikes, with black gore and horseblood. One eye had swollen nearly shut, where a ghoul's knuckles had scraped him. Hessel leaned against the far wall, pale under the filth, one side of his head caked with blood, where the ear had been torn away. The wound had stopped pouring in the night, but blood still oozed from it down his neck in slow, tacky strings. Sen crouched beside Jürgen, muttering prayers to Sigmar, to Mor, to any stern god that watched over fools in forests, and might not have turned away in disgust already. No one moved when the silence came. They listened to it with the same dread they had given the scratching. Silence could mean hunger had gone. It could mean hunger was waiting. It could mean daylight. It could mean the things outside had finally found another way in and were crouched above them in the beams, smiling with their dead men's mouths. Voss tilted his head and listened harder. No scrabbling on the roof, no breathing beyond the barricade, no feeding, no whispering, only the minute sounds of men too long trapped with fear. Brood's slow wheeze through blood-clogged nostrils, Jürgen's fever-hitching breath, Sen's whispered invocations, the tiny pop of torch pitch as it sank into char. Then, faintly from outside the cabin, came the sound of a crow, a single hoarse caw. Then another, farther away. Hessel lifted his head. His face was ravaged by exhaustion, but something mean and practical still burned there. Morning, maybe, Voss said. No one rushed for the door. Men who had survived night by mistrust did not fling themselves at hope just because the sky had turned gray behind it. They waited until they could see a difference in the light leaking through the cracks around the storeroom frame. Black became charcoal. Charcoal became the dirty, water-thin pallor of dawn in winter forest. With that pallor came other sounds, hesitant and small, drips from the eaves. Wind moving somewhere high in the pines. Another crow. A branch creaking under its own weight. The world had started again. Voss straightened with a grunt. Every joint in him seemed to protest. Blood had dried stiff on his clothes, some his, more not. The scratches on his face burned. His sword hand cramped, half closed around the hilt. Up, he said. Brood got to his feet with a groan. Hessel pushed off the wall. Sen crossed himself once over Jürgen and rose. The boy tried to rise too, failed, and snarled through clenched teeth at the betrayal of his own body. You stay upright if you can, Voss said, and it was not comfort, but command. You don't die yet. Jürgen gave a tiny, frantic nod. They dismantled the barricade slowly. No heroics. No noise beyond what necessity forced. Brood shifted the tool chest aside, while Hessel held his sword ready over the gap. Sen took the dying torch from the wall ring and prodded the planks apart enough to peer through. The smoke made his one good eye stream. Well? Voss asked. Sen swallowed. No movement. Open. The first board came free with a sticking groan. Then another. A wedge dropped. Brood took the braced table leg away. Finally, the storeroom door itself, swollen in its frame from damp and impact, stood revealed, its surface scarred to splinters by nails and blows from the night. Voss set his shoulder to it. The door did not move. He set himself again, boots planted in drying blood, and shoved harder. Wood cracked, hinges shrieked. Something heavy scraped on the far side. Brood joined him. Together they drove forward with the dumb, hateful strength of men who wanted something solid to break under them. The door burst open in a splintering crack, and cold grey morning poured into the room. The main chamber beyond looked like the inside of a slaughterhouse after looters had passed through. What little furniture remained had been smashed into driftwood fragments. The shutters hung, broken or torn away entirely, letting in the weak dawn. The roof yawned, open above the loft in two jagged holes. Feathers of charred pitchcloth, spilled grain, and sodden straw were plastered to the floor in gore. Blood had dried in broad black fans across the walls, where arterial sprays had struck and settled. Other blood remained wet, dark and greasy where it was not human. Flies already worried the larger pools. The corpses were mostly gone. Not all at once obvious at first. The eye took in only pieces. Rauch's severed hand near the hearth. A strip of Clem's scalp with hair attached, stuck to the leg of the overturned bench. A length of rib, perhaps horse, perhaps not, gnawed clean and left under the smashed window. One of the dead ghouls remained where Hessel had gutted it, but much of its abdomen had been opened and scooped away in the night by its own kind. Its face was gone. The chimney creature had been dragged from the hearthstones, leaving a broad, greasy smear of black clotted blood and ash. Of Mathis, there remained only the lower half of one leg and a scatter of loose teeth. The rest had been taken. Drag marks scored the floor from the center room, to the broken windows, to the wall seam, to the door, then out into the yard. Long, wet furrows. Here and there a patch of skin, a clot of hair, a sliver of something white and jointed that might once have been finger or toe. Brood stared and crossed himself, not even pretending it was for anything but fear. They cleaned the room. Carry on things do, Sen whispered. Quiet, Voss said. They listened again. Dawn breathed through the shattered cabin. The hearth ticked softly as embers died in their own ash. Somewhere beyond the wall, a crow hopped in the mud and pecked. No sudden rush came. No pale face dropped from the rafters. The predators had withdrawn with the dark. For now, Voss moved first into the main room, sword raised. Hessel followed. Brood limped after with the axe. Sen and Jürgen came last, the old sawyer half supporting the younger man by the arm, though Jürgen still insisted on clutching the splintered spear haft in his remaining fingers. Each step made him hiss. The front door remained barred by the chain and the toppled table, though both were bowed inward by repeated impacts from the night. The wood around the ring had split and showed daylight through a hand-wide crack. Brood gave a humorless grunt. Nia got in anyway. Help me, said Voss. They lifted the table away. Hessel unwound the chain from the staple, his bloody hand slipping twice on the links. At last, the door was free. No one volunteered to open it. Voss did it himself. The hinges gave reluctantly, then the door swung outward onto the yard. Grey morning waited beyond. The clearing looked washed and dead under the dawn, every stump silvered with moisture, every pine trunk black with damp. Mist lay low to the ground, not thick enough to hide things, only enough to make distance uncertain. The wagons stood where they had been pulled in the evening before, one listing in the mud, the other half stripped of its tarp by clawing hands. The lean-to had collapsed inward during the night, and the yard around it had become a butcher's pit. The surviving horses were not missing. They were present in pieces. One head lay near the fence, jaw torn off, and one eye pecked by crows. Another carcass had been dragged halfway from the lean-to, its spine exposed and shiny where flesh had been stripped from either side. Guts looped over a fence rail like red-black rope. Hooves, hide, and hacked-looking sections of meat lay scattered in the trampled mud. Steam no longer rose from any of it. Dawn had cooled the ruin into something waxy and obscene. Jurgen doubled over and gagged up bitter spit. There was nothing left in him to vomit. Sen, who had seen wars and plagues and once a mass grave opened by flood, still turned his face away for a moment and closed his eye against it. Sigmar shielded us, but it was the ground itself that held them. Around the cabin, pressed into the mud, in dozens upon dozens, were tracks, not spoor, not pads, not hooves. Hence, they marked the yard in circling loops around the walls and windows, each print distinct in the dawn damp. Long-fingered impressions with deep gouges where black nails had bitten into the earth for purchase. Some were the size of a man's hand, others much larger, broader across the palm, the fingers absurdly stretched. They overlapped in swarms beneath the broken shutters and roofline, at the lean-to, beside the wall seam where the first white hand had entered. Trails of them led away from the carcasses and into the tree line, as though pale things had run on all fours through the mud, using hands instead of paws and feet instead of feet. Brood stared down at one, lips peeled back in revulsion. That's wrong. No one contradicted him, because there was no language in which it could be right. Voss stepped out onto the threshold and crouched despite the protest in his knees. He put 2 fingers near one of the impressions without touching it. The print had depth, weight. A real thing had made it, flesh or near enough to flesh. The nails had dug so hard the mud was pinched upward in little crescents around each mark. Not wolves, Hessel said dully. Not beast men, Sen added. No, Voss said. The forest watched them from beyond the clearing. That was the only way to think of it. The pines stood rank on rank around the yard, unmoving but attentive. The same silence that had pressed close all night remained, only transformed now. It was no longer the absence before a strike. It was the stillness after feeding, when something hidden licked its teeth and settled deeper into cover. Drag marks led into that silence. Bodies had been taken whole or in parts, hauled over the clearing edge and through the ferns between the trunks. The tracks there became a churn of handprints, blood, and dragged weight. One trail showed where something heavy had bounced over roots, leaving red smears on bark at knee height. Another vanished beneath a stand of elder and thorns so dense it looked like a black wall woven by malice. Brood followed the marks with his gaze, and then looked back over his shoulder toward the south road, as if he could already see it beyond miles of forest. "We go now," he said. "Straight for the village. Straight for anywhere with a bell tower and walls." "We do," said Sen at once, surprising no one. Hessel wiped the crust of blood from his missing ear and squinted toward the drag marks. "And then what? We limp in and tell them grave things took the crew? Half the village will call us drunk. The other half will nail shut their shutters and wait for night. If these things follow, they fed," Brood said. "Maybe they've had their fill." Voss rose slowly from his crouch. Pack hunters feed and come again. That silenced them. He looked older in daylight, older than the night before, older than his years, perhaps. The blood on him had dried into a stiff armor over scratches, bruises, and the grey fatigue beneath. But it was his eyes that had changed most. They had narrowed into something hard and fever-bright, the look of a man whose terror had burned down to a single ugly purpose. "This was no wandering pack," he said. "They knew the cabin. They knew where to test. They circled, waited, pulled back at dawn. This is their ground." Jurgen leaned against the doorframe, trying to keep his entrails where they belonged. "Then all the more reason to leave it." Voss turned toward the woods. "If we leave them a full belly and a safe den, they'll take the next cart too, then the next, then a charcoal burner's hut, then a shepherd's child, then a hamlet, anything warm enough to bleed." "Let soldiers come for them," Brood snapped, "or witch hunters, or priests. I am a woodman, not some damned knight from a ballad. No soldiers are coming in time." "Then let the forest keep its monsters." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Voss did not flare at them. Somehow that was worse. The forest kept them till we woke them. That makes it ours. Brood looked as though he might strike him. Hessel, for all his wounds, watched the exchange with bleak interest. Sen simply seemed tired enough to fold into himself and vanish. It was Jurgen who broke the standoff, though likely without meaning to. He shifted against the frame, hissed at the pain in his belly, and lifted the splintered spear as if pointing without thinking. "There," he whispered, beyond the far edge of the clearing, half hidden under a knot of exposed roots and winter-dead fern, something square and pale protruded from the earth. At first, it looked like common stone. Then the mist slid a little, and its shape resolved. A marker, or a fallen pillar top, something carved by hands long gone. Voss moved toward it at once. The others followed, because morning had not restored sense enough for them to split apart. The ground there sloped slightly upward under the trees, where the logging road had once perhaps bent around an older path. Moss and root had nearly swallowed the stone. Only one face remained visible, crusted with lichen and veined by cracks. But on that face, a carving could still be made out beneath centuries of weather. A shield device, quartered by a vertical line. Above it, a bat-winged helm, or stylized predator's head. Below it, a ring of tiny stars, almost worn smooth. No one recognized the crest. That did not make it harmless. Sen crouched, wincing with the effort, and brushed away some of the moss. "Noble work," he said. "Old, very old. Empire?" Hessel asked. "Maybe before this stretch was properly held. Maybe one of those petty lines who ruled a valley and thought themselves princes, till plague, or war, or a stronger neighbor ground them under." Voss touched the edge of the stone. It was cold as river iron, or until they rotted and crawled back out. No one laughed. Nearby, mostly covered in leaf mold, another dressed stone peered up from the earth. Then another farther back among the roots. Not a single marker then. A boundary, a ruin, a burial place eaten by forest over generations until only fragments remained. Their cutting site, their road, the cabin itself, perhaps built on the edge of something older and better left unnamed. Brood stared deeper between the trunks and swallowed hard. In the brush beyond, where dawn could not yet fully enter, There were shapes that might have been toppled walls, black stones under moss, hollows in the ground too regular to be animal burrows, the suggestion of a staircase going nowhere. "By all the gods," he murmured. "We camped in its yard." The drag marks led straight that way. They passed between bramble patches and roots, down into the fern dark where the hidden stones waited. The ground beyond the clearing was stirred and torn, as if many things had gone back and forth during the night. Here the handprints were thicker, deeper, and larger in places, overlapping around a particular set of impressions that made every man stop. Those prints were monstrous. Still hand-shaped, yes, but broader than a dinner plate. The fingers long as knives, and dug so deep into the mud that water already seeped into them. Whatever had made them had moved heavily but with terrible balance, each impression set in neat, deliberate spacing. Not one of the darting scavengers from the cabin then. Something bigger, something that had not needed to rush. Sen's face grayed beneath the grime. "That weren't a feeder?" "No," Voss said. His voice had gone very flat. "That's what the feeders followed." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The forest held itself around the revelation, dark and damp and infinitely patient. "A hunting pack," Voss had said. Now the truth of it stood before them in the mud. The pale carrion things that had harried the cabin were not the oldest evil in these woods. They were curs around a stronger beast, jackals about a lion's kill. Something larger nested deeper in the buried place beyond the trees. Something that perhaps once wore a noble crest and had, over the long rot of generations, become the lord of grave scavengers and corpse-eaters. Jurgen made a small broken sound. "We can't go in there." "Not with 4 men," Hessel said. "Not with one of them half disemboweled and the rest half dead." Brood seized on that at once, with almost desperate relief. "Then that's decided. We run south. We gather what steel and fire we can, and anyone who calls us liars can come look at the damned prince himself." This time Voss did not argue. He looked once more into the trees, toward the drag marks and the hidden ruin, and whatever he saw in his own mind there he sealed behind his scarred face like a gate shutting. "We leave," he said. Now, they returned to the cabin only long enough to take what mattered. A water skin, 2 unbroken axes, Hessel's sword belt, Clem's spare quarrels, a sack with hard bread, and a strip of salt pork, untouched by blood. Sen found a cloak not too badly fouled, and wrapped it around Jurgen's middle to hide the red seepage spreading through his bandages. Brood took a hammer tucked through his belt. Voss took a torch bundle, and the flint. No one discussed burial. There was too little left of the dead and too much day to waste on gentleness. When they stepped away from the threshold for the last time, dawn had strengthened into a wan, cold morning. The ruined cabin stood behind them with its broken roof and blood-smeared door, looking less like shelter now than an infected wound in the clearing. Handprints ringed it everywhere in the mud, a filthy wreath of impossible anatomy around the place where men had begged not to die. They crossed the yard in a limping knot, every man turning his back on the trees with visible reluctance, and made for the road south. None of them noticed at first that Brood had fallen silent. He had been breathing hard from pain and lack of sleep. That was nothing unusual. But after perhaps 20 paces down the road, with the cabin almost hidden by mist and tree trunks behind them, he stopped. Not abruptly, simply halted and stood with his head cocked a little to one side as though listening. Voss turned. "Move." Brood did not answer. Sen frowned. "What is it?" Brood raised one broad hand to the side of his neck and touched just below the ear. His fingers came away red. At first everyone thought it was dried blood from the night. There had been enough of it. Then he turned his head farther. On the thick muscle of his neck, half hidden in the beard line, were 4 fresh marks. Not deep, no more than furrows, but ugly. Parallel, angry red against dirty skin, as though black nails had raked him there in the chaos, and he had never felt it. Brood stared at the blood on his fingertips. Jurgen saw it, and went white as tallow. Hessel's grip tightened on his sword until the knuckles stood out. Sen's mouth opened around a prayer and closed again without sound. Voss looked from the wound to Brood's face. There was nothing in the big man's expression yet beyond confusion, fear, and the beginning of a dreadful understanding. No fever, no madness, no change, except the scratch and the blood. That made it worse. Behind them, the cabin loomed faint through the mist, black-roofed and broken. Around it, the handprints circled in the dawn mud like a blasphemous script no priest could read. Beyond it, the forest waited, watchful and still, keeping its oldest secrets under root and stone until night would come again. No one spoke. Then, with the road south lying open before them, and the woodsman's cabin behind like a stain that would never wash clean from memory, the survivors began to walk.